you picture the environment, what immediately comes to mind? Probably lush green forests, right? Maybe deep oceans or exotic wildlife. But what if the environment is actually a story about power? Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to dive right into the hidden socio-political layers of environmentalism. And to do this, we're using India as a really powerful microcosm to understand a much larger global struggle. Basically, it's this massive tension between centralized state power on one hand and grassroots local sustainability on the other, especially in the developing world. Because ultimately, this isn't just about saving the trees. It's fundamentally about human society and who actually gets to decide how our planet's resources are used. To really set the stage here, we have to start with ecologist Barry Commoner. He has this absolutely brilliant rule, which is there is no free lunch in the biological or social world. And this perfectly sets up our entire exploration today. Think about it. Every single resource our modern civilization consumes and every piece of waste we toss out, it all carries a cost. It doesn't just magically disappear. That cost has to be paid by someone or something somewhere down the line. Which naturally brings us to the ultimate question we really need to unpack today. When you look at the massive sweeping benefits of industrial growth, all that modern development going straight to urban elites and giant corporations, who is actually left footing the bill? Who is paying that free lunch tab? Well, to answer that, we first need to define exactly what we mean when we talk about the natural world around us. Philosopher Dale Jamieson provides a super helpful distinction here. He argues that the environment is something that's subject to human management. Think of it like a built environment, like your corner bakery. Nature, on the other hand, operates completely independently of us. Think of the moon or the deep ocean. But as we're going to see, over time, human civilization has basically tried to pull all of independent nature into our manageable environment just so we can control and consume it. And historically, our relationship with nature has shifted pretty drastically. Historian Lewis Mumford actually mapped this out. He argues that civilization transitioned from an eotechnic phase, which is where we lived pretty harmoniously off renewable income like wood and water, right into the paleotechnic phase of the Industrial Revolution, which was driven heavily by coal and iron. This was a literal game changer. Humanity fundamentally recast nature. Instead of just living off nature's renewable income, we essentially broke into the vault to mine its finite capital. And that shift, it dramatically changed how different groups of people interact with the Earth. So let's break down the cast of characters in this modern ecological drama, as mapped out by scholars Madhav Gadgil and Ramachandra Guha. First step, we have ecosystem people. These folks rely entirely on local resources. For a tribal family or a small peasant farmer, the disappearance of a local forest isn't some abstract environmental debate on the news. It's a direct, immediate threat to their daily survival. And because their connection is so deep, they possess this incredibly practical folk knowledge of their local ecosystems. Standing in really sharp contrast to the ecosystem people are the omnivores. And let's be real, if you are watching this explainer right now, there's a very good chance you fall into this category. These are urban elites, industrialists, and bureaucrats who consume globally. Think about it. An omnivore sitting in a major city might drink tea imported from the Himalayas while using electricity generated by a dam hundreds of miles away. The absolutely crucial point here is that omnivores are completely shielded from local ecological collapse. If one forest gets totally depleted, no problem. They just use their economic and political power to switch to a new resource pool somewhere else. Tragically, when the massive resource demands of the omnivores collide with the survival needs of the ecosystem people, it creates our third group, ecological refugees. When the state steps in and claims land for giant development projects, like, for example, the Narmada Dam in India, which ended up submerging ancestral tribal lands, ecosystem people are physically uprooted. They're stripped of their traditional livelihoods, pushed out of their homes, and frequently forced into these incredibly crowded urban shantytowns. So you have to ask, why does this displacement happen so systematically? Well, academic analysis by Gadgil and Guha points to a structural iron triangle of power. This whole setup isn't an accident. On one point of the triangle, you have large-scale industrial beneficiaries demanding cheap resources. On another, state bureaucrats controlling the permits and physical access. And on the third, politicians providing the legal framework to keep the whole machine running smoothly. Together, critics argue, this powerful alliance ensures that the natural capital of a nation is funneled straight toward the urban omnivores, while passing the heavy costs right down to the rural poor. To really grasp the stark inequality of these centralized economic models, just look at the historical pricing of bamboo in India. This is mind-blowing. State bureaucracies would literally hand over raw bamboo to industrial paper mills at heavily subsidized, almost throwaway prices. But at the exact same time, the poor local artisans and basket weavers, the people who actually depend on that bamboo for their day-to-day survival, were charged the full market price. The authors point out that this system artificially subsidized the profligate consumption of the elite while actively penalizing local survival. It's just wild. And we can actually physically see the failure of this top-down planning right out on the landscape. Take a look at ancient sacred groves, like those of the goddess Karakanama. Local communities there successfully protected incredible biodiversity for centuries just through local folk ecology. Now contrast that with the results of state-mandated exotic monoculture plantations. The state planted these massive eucalyptus forests that famously fell prey to a fungal infection called pink disease and absolutely decimated the local soil. It perfectly highlights how replacing local grounded wisdom with a distant, monolithic bureaucracy so often leads straight to disaster. Now, this local clash over resource usage actually scales up globally into two very distinct environmental movements. The sources draw a line between the environmentalism of affluence, which is mostly found in the industrialized north. That movement often focuses heavily on aesthetics, leisure, and preserving this idea of a pristine wilderness completely free from humans. On the flip side, you have the environmentalism of the poor in the developing south. For them, environmentalism isn't about setting up a nice hiking trail, it's about survival, livelihood, and distributive justice. For them, it is quite literally a fight for their existence. Which brings us to a deeply contentious issue. As noted by academic critics, when northern environmental movements try to impose their strict preservationist agendas onto the south, it can sometimes morph into what's called green imperialism. This is a scholarly argument pointing out what happens when international organizations demand the creation of massive national parks, like Nagarhole National Park in India. The creation of these parks has sometimes resulted in the violent displacement of indigenous people, all just to create a pristine, untouched wilderness for global tourists. Critics argue this effectively treats the developing world as a sort of human zoo, putting preservation aesthetics way above the actual survival of local citizens. And if you want a number that truly lands the impact of this global inequality, here it is. 80%. Now, global elites often like to point to population growth in the developing world as the primary driver of environmental degradation. But these researchers argue the data tells a completely different story. They point out that a staggering 80% of the planet's resources are consumed by just 20% of the world's population living in the industrialized north. To them, it's this profligate consumption, not just sheer population numbers, that's truly draining the earth dry. And this inequality doesn't just happen at the macro level with big dams and forests. It extends all the way down into the microscopic realm of modern biotechnology. For centuries, traditional peasant households developed a massive variety of medicinal knowledge and crop genes, like totally unique, resilient rice varieties. But today, foreign corporations come in and extract this genetic data through a process academics call biopiracy. They literally patent these traditional resources without offering a dime in compensation to the original local stewards of that folk ecology. It becomes this incredibly unequal exchange where the developing world just exports its biological wealth for absolutely nothing. So, what do we do about all this? How do the authors suggest we fix it? Well, to chart a path forward and reclaim our biological heritage, they argue we have to move toward what they call an economy of permanence. And the steps to get there require a massive fundamental shift. First, we've got to decentralize state power back to the grassroots level. Second, we actually need to respect and utilize local folk ecology instead of overriding it. And third, we must implement joint forest management, something similar to the really successful models pioneered in West Bengal, where the state finally enters into genuine, respectful partnerships with local ecosystem people. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a critical final thought to mull over. How are we as a global society going to choose to balance human development with the lasting health of the earth? Are we going to just continue down this path of carboniferous capitalism and reckless consumption that really only benefits a select few? Or are we actually going to have the courage to empower the powerless and build an economy of permanence? A system where the harvest of nature is managed so carefully that its capital remains totally intact for generations to come. The choice is ultimately ours. Thanks so much.